Okay, so good morning. Very welcome to this table of parenting and its effects on delinquency. I think no one in this room will dare in saying that parenting has no effect on delinquency. After 40 years of research on parenting, and we have treated it in so many ways. I have just collected some of the parenting aspects that we have been studying, and this parental monitoring, psychological control or over-control, support, rejection, hostility, ineffective parenting, disruptive parenting, single parenthood, teenager parenthood, and of course the work of the most extreme negative ways of delinquency in all forms of child abuse, child maltreatment, harsh punishment, or even neglect, emotional deprivation, etc. So my question is, if we have 40 years of research and if we have studied so much in parenting, why are we still sit here discussing on parenting and have a whole seminar and a whole almost symposium dedicated to parenting? And well, I thought that if we are still here today, it's because there is still a lot of work to do. One day and almost a half of symposium is telling us that. But I don't want to take more time from the presentations. I'm just doing a small presentation of each one of the colleagues in this panel. And after we'll have perhaps 15, 20 minutes for each one of us to present our studies, and hope to have 20 minutes at the end for questions and a good discussion. So I will start for the logic that is presented in the book of abstracts. And first we start with Nicole Trauffer. Okay, Nicole is a PhD student at the lab of Professor Reuven, and they study the long-term consequences of child abuse and neglect. And Nicole's work she's looking specifically on how child maltreatment and other factors are related to female perpetrated crime. And she comes today to tell us about at what extent childhood abuse and psychiatric disorders, mainly PSTD, are related to violent and non-violent offending in females, specific in females. After, in the second place, I will present my work. I come from Mid-Sweden University, and we have been working with Professor Åke Statin from Örebro. Our work is motivated mainly by some dangerous, or what we consider, and after we want to listen your opinion, what we consider dangerous advices that adolescents are receiving in schools, mainly from the strategies of health prevention, with a message that they are being bombarded with, that is, you don't need to tell your parents. And we'll discuss and made some analysis in data that we have about this. In third place comes the presentation of Hagit. Hope to spell it well. Hagit is a PhD in sociology. Currently, she's head of the subject for criminology department in Western Galilee College. Is that correct? Okay. And she's also research associated in the Center for the Study of Society at the University of Haifa. Okay. Hagit research areas are broad. She has been working in judicial decision-making, fear of crime, and immigration and crime. And today, Hagit brings us a developmental approach to the study of the effect of changes in family structure on the family ability to monitor the youth criminal behavior. And last but not the least comes Limor. Limor brings us an interesting work on the gap between child and parent perception of what is the relation. I thought a very interesting work, and its effects on juvenile delinquency. Limor is a PhD endocrinologist specialized in rehabilitation of juvenile offenders, and she's a lecturer in the Western Galilee College in Israel too, and an active member in a research center that studies parenting and delinquency. Is that correct? Okay, so I don't want to take more time, and I give the word to Nicole.
All right. Thank you for having me today. My name is Nicole Trauffer, and I'm a student of Dr. Whittam's. And today I'm going to be presenting our research on child abuse and neglect and psychiatric disorders in nonviolent and violent female offenders. So based on FBI crime statistics, over the last 30 years, there has been a steady increase in the percentage of violent arrests for females in the United States, with about 10% of the total violent arrests being made for females in the 80s, and now about 20% of those violent arrests being made for females in the early 2000s. This trend is due both to a large decrease in the number of violent arrests for males, and that's what you can see at the top of the screen, and then also a small increase in the number of violent arrests for females. Much of the research, due to the fact that most of the crimes have traditionally been committed by males, has focused specifically on males, and the research that's looked at female offending has focused on maltreatment and also on psychiatric disorders, and I'm going to review that a bit right now. So much of the research looking at childhood maltreatment looks at female incarcerated samples and their retrospective reports of childhood abuse and neglect. And we see that about 23 to 47% of female offenders retrospectively report having been abused as children. Additionally, female state prisoners are more likely to report abuse histories if they're convicted of a violent offense than of a nonviolent offense. Looking prospectively, so looking at those who were abused and neglected and following them through to adulthood, Dr. Whittam has found that child abuse predicted female juvenile violent crime. So much of the research related to psychiatric disorders in female crime has looked at incarcerated females as well, finding a higher prevalence of many disorders including schizophrenia, depression, substance abuse, and antisocial personality disorders in these incarcerated populations in comparison to non-offenders in the general population. Specifically, when looking at violent offending, there's been a lot of focus on post-traumatic stress disorder and substance abuse in women. Women are more likely to meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder than are men, and there's been some research that suggests that child abuse is indirectly related to female violence through PTSD. In relation to substance abuse, female offenders have higher rates of alcohol and stimulant use than is found in the general population, and studies looking specifically at intimate partner violence have found that women with alcohol and cocaine use disorders, they are associated more likely with intimate partner violence. In a sample taken from Finland, which is one of the best samples that we have of female offenders, we see that about 44% of Finnish female homicidal offenders met criteria for alcohol abuse. There are some limitations that are noteworthy in the previous research. First, as I mentioned before, the large focus on males and only a small focus on females. Second, the focus on females has only really focused on women who are incarcerated. So while we do have histories that they report of childhood abuse and neglect, we're unable to see those who may have been abused and neglected that did not end up being incarcerated in those samples. Additionally, relatedly, most research on offender mental illness was only focusing on those who were incarcerated and lacked adequate comparison groups. So they weren't matched based on factors such as race or social class. Additionally, few studies have examined the prevalence of psychiatric disorders in violent versus nonviolent offenders for females and has focused more so on offenders in general. And finally, the majority of studies have been cross-sectional in nature, which leads to an ambiguity regarding the temporal sequence. So what's coming first, abuse or psychiatric disorders or later offending. So the purpose of the current study was to investigate the extent to which childhood abuse and neglect predicts violent arrests in non-incarcerated women, and also the extent to which women who have arrests for violent and nonviolent crimes are at increased risk for psychiatric disorders compared to a comparison group of women without those arrests. So there are 4 main hypotheses for this paper. First, that females with documented histories of childhood maltreatment would be more likely to be offenders as compared to matched controls. Second, that female offenders will have higher rates of psychiatric disorders than non-offenders, and violent offenders will have higher rates of psychiatric disorders than non-violent offenders. Third, that violent offenders will have higher rates of mood disorders, PTSD, alcohol, and drug abuse compared to nonviolent offenders, and that individuals who have both a history of childhood maltreatment and PTSD diagnosis will be at the greatest risk for becoming offenders. So the design of this study used a large prospective cohort design study based on Dr. Whittam's research, comparing maltreated children to a matched non-maltreated control. The original sample came from a Midwestern metropolitan area, and it started as an archival study looking at substantiated cases of childhood abuse and neglect from children who were under the age of 12 between the ages of 1967 and 1971 based on court records, and then matching that group to a control group that was based on age, race, sex, and approximate family social class. They were then followed with records into arrest records at 3 different points in time, and then also met with to have a variety of different interviews. And I'll go a little bit more into which variables are used here. So the current sample included 582 females with a mean age of about 29, and that was at the time of interview for psychiatric history of diagnosis. About 60% of the sample is white, 40% is Black, Hispanic, Native American, and Asian, but the majority of that part of the sample is Black. I'm going to explain a little bit more how we broke them down into these groups, but about 63% of the sample was non-offenders, so no history of any kind of arrest. 30% are non-violent offenders, and about 7% were violent offenders. So as I mentioned before, childhood abuse and neglect was based on substantiated cases from court records from 1967 to 1971. I think most of us are pretty familiar with the definition of physical abuse and sexual abuse, but I just want to touch upon neglect, which is defined as the extreme failure to provide adequate food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention to the child. For arrest history, there were complete criminal histories located from state, local, and federal law enforcement in 1986 and 1994. I then broke them down into groups based on offense type. So the violent offender group are those that had arrest histories for a violent crime, and that's defined as crime and attempts of murder, rape, manslaughter, assault, battery, robbery, and burglary with injury. Then anyone who had any other non-violent, non-status, non-traffic arrest was in the non-violent offender category, and then anyone with no history of any arrest was in the non-offender category. So at age 23, a psychiatric assessment was given, which was based on the diagnostic interview schedule for DSM-3R, and that was from 1987, so we're now at DSM-5, just for reference. And this is the breakdown of the diagnoses in this sample for lifetime diagnoses, so not just what they met criteria for at the time of interview, but what they had ever met criteria for. And I just want to point out the diagnosis of dysthymia on the bottom. That's now considered pervasive depressive disorder, and it's basically a longer-lasting, milder version of depression. All right, so first, looking at the groups retrospectively, so having already broken them into these categories of violent offender, non-violent offender, and non-offender, I compared the prevalence of histories of childhood maltreatment. So as you can see, in the violent offense column, they have the largest percentage of histories of childhood abuse and neglect, and each type of childhood abuse and neglect, followed by the non-violent offenders, followed by non-offenders. When this was analyzed using chi-squares, it was found that female offenders, so both violent and non-violent offenders, did not significantly differ from each other, but they did significantly differ from non-offenders, meaning that female offenders had higher rates of childhood maltreatment histories than did non-offenders. So looking prospectively to see whether or not childhood abuse and neglect and each type of childhood abuse and neglect predicts each type of offending. I just want to orient you to this table. The first column shows the difference between violent and non-offenders. The second column is violent versus non-violent offenders, and the third is non-violent versus non-offenders. And this shows the adjusted odds ratios for each. Childhood abuse and neglect predicted the difference between violent and non-offenders, and also predicted the difference between non-violent and non-offenders. That is to say that those with a history of childhood abuse and neglect were about 3 times as likely to become violent versus non-offenders, while those with childhood abuse and neglect were also about twice as likely to become non-violent offenders versus non-offenders. And as you can see in the non-violent versus non-offender column, this holds across each type of childhood abuse and neglect. But for violent and non-violent and non-offenders, only physical abuse predicted the difference between violent and non-offenders. And that shows that those who had a history of physical abuse were about at 5 times increased risk of becoming violent versus a non-offender. And I just want to point out in the middle column that there were no significant differences found between violent and non-violent offenders in their histories of childhood abuse and neglect. So that is to say that childhood abuse and neglect did not predict the difference between violent and non-violent offenders. I then looked at each of the psychiatric disorders, controlling for age, race, sex, and sorry, I should have mentioned on the last slide that was also controlled for age and race. So controlling for age, race, and history of child abuse and neglect, I then compared again these different groups, and I did this for each of the psychiatric disorders that I mentioned earlier, but these are the only significant results that I'm showing here. So as you can see, PTSD predicted the difference between violent and non-offenders, and also the difference between violent and non-violent offenders. And PTSD was the only psychiatric disorder to predict the difference between violent and non-violent offenders. There's also a significant interaction between childhood abuse and neglect and PTSD, and I'll get a little bit more into that on the next slide. History of drug abuse disorders predicted the difference between nonviolent and non-offenders, and dysthymia predicted the difference between violent and non-offenders. And I will get into a little bit more of potential reasons why that might be in my discussion. So to take a closer look at the interaction between childhood maltreatment and PTSD and violent offending, just so to orient you, this on the y-axis shows the percent of violent offenses, and the top line is those who were maltreated in childhood, and the dashed line is the control sample. So regardless of whether or not they met criteria for PTSD, those in the childhood maltreatment group were at about equal levels of likelihood of going on to be violent offenders. However, when we look at the control group, those who have no PTSD were unlikely to be violent offenders, while those with PTSD met the levels about of those who had a history of childhood maltreatment, suggesting that PTSD plays an important role specifically for those who do not have a history of childhood maltreatment. So overall, to look at the results that I presented today, childhood maltreatment predicted offending compared to non-offending, and childhood maltreatment overall predicted violent offending compared to non-offending, and this was specifically shown for physical abuse, but not sexual abuse or neglect in the prediction of violent offending compared to non-offending. Childhood maltreatment did not predict the difference between violent and non-violent offenders. In relation to psychiatric condition, female offenders had higher incidences of psychiatric disorders than did non-offenders. When looking specifically at drugs, which we saw predicted the difference between non-violent and non-offenders, one of those reasons may be that crimes could be committed in order to feed drug habits, which is why they're getting arrested. It could be that drugs lead to dangerous situations and poor choices when one is intoxicated or uninhibited. And another thing that's specific for drug use is that there are crimes specifically related to drug use. So the possession of a drug, which is part of a psychiatric diagnosis, is also a offense in and of itself. Interestingly, the results showed that dysthymia, but not major depression, was related to violent offending versus non-offending. One theory perhaps for this is that depression may be more debilitating, and those with dysthymia are more likely to be in a situation where they might go on to offend. But also, dysthymia has been shown to be more likely to be comorbid with personality disorders. So it may be that in this sample, the personality disorders might be driving the offending, and the dysthymia is simply comorbid with it. So I think the big takeaway message in this study is that PTSD and violent offending are specifically related, and PTSD increased a woman's risk for violent arrest specifically, and not just arrest of any kind. PTSD had a stronger effect on the controls than the childhood maltreatment group, and future research should look at the temporal sequence of violent offending and onset of PTSD, as one could meet criteria for PTSD and then offend, or vice versa. One example of this may be a battered woman who is traumatized and then eventually violently offends against her perpetrator, and that would be PTSD predating the offense. Or there could be someone who is a female gang member who witnesses and is part of a lot of violence and then becomes traumatized as a result of her violent offending, with violent offending becoming first and then PTSD coming later. So some limitations of the current study: as I mentioned, we did not address temporal sequence in this study. Additionally, the study is based on the DSM-3R, and there have been some changes to the PTSD diagnostic criteria since then. Additionally, only substantiated cases of childhood maltreatment were used in this sample, which means that we're likely underestimating childhood maltreatment in general in the sample. There's things that didn't reach the level of the court's attention, and so there might be something special about this sample of maltreated children. Also, this sample consists mainly of women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, so it's unclear the extent to which this would generalize to other samples of maybe middle class or upper class samples. I'd like to acknowledge all of those who supported this research through funding, and also everyone in my lab and Dr. Whittam for all of her support throughout this process. And thank you all very much for your time.
Good. Okay, just let me. Okay. So I'm going to tell you about, as I told you at the beginning, work that we start with, where we looked at data collected by Professor Okanstatin in Örebro in a large sample of juveniles from the community. And this work starts or is driven by our concern for some advices that adolescents are receiving in these moments in schools, mainly that come from the strategies for health prevention. And one of the big advices that students are receiving is that you don't need to tell your parents. And this is being told to kids of 16, 17 years old. And with all that have been the work of Professor Okanstatin and what is child disclosure, parental knowledge, and the influence that this has in adolescent or juvenile delinquency, we had come up with this analysis. And our main thought is, okay, is there a path that kids do not disclose because they are afraid to lack the support of parents? So, but just to make a brief framework of what have been our study, and this comes from all the studies that so many years ago have been looking in what is parenting, parental supervision affects or is a predictor of delinquency in adulthood during adolescence. Low parental involvement can predict delinquency. Poor parental-child communication predicts delinquency. Mainly parental monitoring has been seen as the greatest or strong family management factor that can affect delinquency. In the effects of parental monitoring on antisocial behavior and mental health have been looked also differently for boys and girls, so on a gender effect. And what have been seen is that low parental monitoring increases the rates of delinquency in boys or the antisocial behavior in boys and increases the rates of mental health problems in girls. It's also a predictor of alcohol and substance misuse, attenuates when we have good parental monitoring or high levels of parental monitoring. This attenuates the effect of peers or delinquent peers in the antisocial behavior of the kids. And when parental monitoring is taken together with emotional support, they have a big effect on the prediction of delinquent behavior. But what have been one of the, I would say, milestones in the study of parental monitoring, Professors Statin and Margaret Kerr in 2000, is it was their question, what is parental monitoring? And they come up with an important article on that moment and on parenting, and that is that parental knowledge shows stronger associations with child disclosure with parent solicitation than with parent solicitation or parental control. So there is mainly three ways of parental knowledge. Parents can be acknowledged because they solicitate information from the kids, because they establish fixed rules. You don't go out with your friends, so I know where you are all the time, or because kids are willing to disclose information to the parents. And what they show, and this last article, it's a systematic review on 161 studies, and Reuven and colleagues, what they show is that parental knowledge and child disclosure are really strong related with delinquency. So in the past year, our last study, what we have we bring that work from here, from the symposium last year, and is that parental knowledge and child disclosure the graphs from above are self-report from the kids, the plots from lower are from the parents' report, and what we saw is that even those kids who have higher callous and emotional traits or psychopathic traits, even in these kids, high parental knowledge and high child disclosure have a protective effect on delinquency. So our research question for the study and for the results that I'm going to show you now was this: is the relationship between adolescents' willingness to disclose information to their parents and both delinquency, because we saw this differently for boys and girls, delinquency and depression as an indicator of mental health, is that mediated by the adolescents' perceived lack of parental support. We made this analysis in a short-term longitudinal study. The target population was all the kids in 8th grade in 1998 in Örebro. So the first wave was taken in 1,186 students with a mean age of 40 years. And the second wave was, so the kids were evaluated 2 years after this. And we made the analysis in 918 students that were all those students who had valid measures at wave 1 and wave 2. The measures, just to have an idea of what is now this, let me see if we can open, oh, I'm sorry, perhaps we cannot, what is use disclosure, perhaps it's not, yeah. These are the measures, so this was measure disclosure in 10 items, like if you are worried about something, do you talk with one of your parents, or do you talk with your mom or dad about intimate things, etc. So this was the measure of disclosure. The measure of parental support. Items like it was 6 items that measure things like they remind me. So what happens if you do something that your parents really dislike, and they had the possibility to say they remind me about their disappointment long afterwards, they do not talk to me for a while, they are silent and cold toward me, etc. So this is the lack of parental support. And delinquency was measured in 15 items, asking for the previous year or the previous 12 months. Have you been make some of these behaviors, shoplifting, vandalize something, steal something from the pocket of someone, etc. And depressive mood was taken in 20 items, in a scale of 20 items. Just for make a brief description of what we found, in generally, girls disclose more to their parents. Boys perceive a bit more of lack of support, although the effect is not very high. Boys report more higher levels of delinquency than girls, and girls report more higher levels of depressive mood than boys. So this is what we would expect in a community sample, in a normal sample of adolescents. Among the zero-order correlations, what we see is that in general, those kids who do not disclose at time 1 are those also who do not disclose in time 2, with a correlation of 0.5 for boys and 0.6 for girls. And for girls, all the variables of lack support, delinquency and depression are correlated with disclosure, and for boys, the lack of support is not related, or disclosure is not related with the lack of support at time 1. And when we start with the analysis of mediation, we split it for boys. We analyzed differently boys and girls. And what we see in boys is that those boys who do not disclose information to their parents at time 1, so when they have 14 years old, this is not really important for delinquency when they have 16, or does not predict delinquency when they have 16 years old. But if and we repeat the same model for disclosure at time 2, although of course at time 2 we don't know if the relation is in this way or in the other way around. So we don't know really if kids do not disclose and this predicts delinquency, or they are committing delinquent behaviors, and because of this, they do not disclose to their parents. But what we saw is that there is a direct association between disclosure and delinquency. So that kids do not disclose at time 2, when they have 16 years old, is really important. It's really associated with delinquency at time 2. When it comes for depression, and we control the outcome at time 2, control for the outcome at time 1. And so what we saw in boys still is that there is a significant direct effect on disclosure on depression that is not mediated by the lack of parental support. So those kids who do not disclose when they have 14 years old are those kids who have, this can predict the depressive mood when they are 16 years old. And in time 2, when we look at disclosure in time 2, what we see is that there is a mediation effect of the lack support. So those who do not disclose they lack the support of parents, and this comes with an effect through the depression. In girls, and also this result was expected. There is no effect on disclosure on delinquency, mainly because the self-report of delinquency in girls from schools, it's very low. The rates in Sweden, it's very low. So we didn't see, or there is no result of the girls who do not disclose information and delinquency at time 1 or time 2. However, when we go through the indicator of mental health problems with depression, we see here that is a mediation effect of the lack of parental support on depression. So those who do not disclose are also those who lack the support of parents, and this has an effect on the depressive mood in girls. And the mediation effect of the lack of support goes through 0.6 or 60% of the effect is from the mediator in disclosure in time 1, and in 40% of the effect on disclosure on time 2. So just to make a brief summary of the findings, because in mediation models we sometimes get lost a bit, just to make a summary of the findings, not disclose information to the parents during early adolescence is not significant for subsequent delinquency among the community adolescents. So it's not so important when kids have 14 years old, but definitely when they have 16 years old, this is related in boys, this correlates with delinquency, although this effect is not seen in girls from the community. And disclosure is related with depression in both early and late adolescence, or if we can tell early and late, 14 years and 16 years old, and especially in girls, and the effect is mediated by the lack of parental support. So in our conclusions, what we wanted to bring in a forum like this is that in schools, the prevention policies should foster adolescent disclosure of information to their parents. It is important that from the schools, the kids receive these messages. This can result as a delinquency protective factor for boys, independent of the lack of parental support and previous levels of delinquency. At the same time, preventive policies should target parents and encourage the parental support during early and later stages of adolescence to prevent depressive moods, to prevent mental health problems among the community adolescents. And so this message that the kids are receiving from schools, that you don't need to tell your parents, we definitely think that should be avoided as a strategy of health prevention. And no one is telling that, or we think that prevent single parenthood and teenager parenthood is a good strategy for kids in schools. No one is discussing that, but what we discuss is the way how this is done. And well, this is my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to talk about family structure and parental monitoring as two factors that affecting juvenile delinquency. But I'm going to put it in context. We all know the literature already discussed that. And we know that delinquency occurs when parents fail to monitor and sanction inappropriate behavior. And we also know that youth from broken homes seems to be more, most of the studies shows that slightly more, but still more prone to delinquency than youth that comes from intact families. And we know that during adolescence, parental divorce or separation can be a major event, can be a risk factor for youth that experience it. And it's not new, and we hear about it a lot these 2 days. I want to take this into the context of immigration. My research is focused on immigrant teenagers. They are first generation. All of them were not born in Israel, but immigrated to Israel between childhood and adolescence. And we know that immigration and acculturation, along with the adolescent process, can be a risk factor. They experience the transition into being an adult. And in addition to that, they have to face new society, new friends, and a lot of developmental tasks that comes together. So the study focused on these adolescents and tried to see how difficulties in acculturation process can predict delinquency. If I take it into a focus on the family, we also know that the youth adapt faster than their parents, and then they tend not. You talked about disclosure. They don't feel that their parents can give them any help or advice, and they tend to go to their peers. The parents, as a result of that, lose their ability to control the children, and then we expect that if they go to delinquent peers, they will tend to be more prone to delinquency. Our study showed in another analysis that when they go to other immigrant peers that experience the same difficulties as they are, it serves as a protective factor. But if they socialize more with the native-born peers, then they are more prone to delinquency. So social support and peer support is an important factor, but it depends on who are the peers. And we know that the family itself experiences a lot of crisis. There is a lot of financial pressure, and parents are busy with initiating a new career and finding a home. And in Israel, it's renting an apartment is not the norm. You have to buy an apartment, and it's not easy to new families. So the family experiences a lot of crisis, and it goes also to the children. So while the main objective of the study was to follow immigrant teenagers and to see how the acculturation process affects their behavior, I want to focus on the effect of changes in family structure on the parents' ability to monitor youth, and to that which leads to delinquent behavior. I will focus only. We had I'll just all the studies based on self-report, and we had two measures of criminal behavior. We had juvenile delinquency, which is a status offenses. Most of them related to the adolescence period, or not severe criminal acts. And we had also criminality, which is all severe criminal behavior. I will focus on juvenile delinquents, on the status offenses, and I'm doing it because we found that none of this, not monitoring, but the family structure does not affect on the criminal behavior. It affects much more on the delinquent behavior. The sample description of the study, it's a longitudinal national survey. We had 3 waves, and it was 10 years ago, and now we are now recently doing a 4th wave, and we try to see where they are now when they are young adults. But my study will focus on their period of adolescence. We had 1,420 adolescents aged between 12 and 18, all immigrated from the former Soviet Union to Israel. We focused only on this group of immigrants in order to control a cultural effect. Their length of stay in Israel at the first wave of the study was up to 6 years because we wanted to capture the acculturation process. And as of the first wave, 70% of them reported on being involved in at least 2 or 3 delinquent acts. So this is a sample, and I'm going to show you OLS regression analysis of their delinquency in the third wave, but since I want to measure the effect of the change, I took all of the independent variables from the third wave and created one measure that related to changes in family structure. So I looked at the parental family status in the first wave, the second wave, and the third wave, and differentiated between those that had a stable family structure. They were either single-parent family, but they came to Israel with only one parent and stayed as a single family during the whole period of the study, or they came as an intact family and stayed during the whole period of the study as a whole family. And these two groups were coded as stable families, and they took those and compared them to those who, during the 3 years of the study, divorced or remarried. These were the not stable families. And I also measured family cohesion, family monitoring, parent-child conflicts, the family structure itself. What are they now? Divorced, single-parent, two-parents family, and, as I said, changes in the family structure. We also examined the sharing, and you talked about it. It wasn't significant in our analysis, and maybe it's related to the fact, to what you found, that in the younger age, it's not affecting their behavior, but I also wanted to test this effect in addition to delinquent peers, which we know that have a lot of effect on the teenagers. I also measured attitude concerning obeying the law, which include statements like, if the law is unfair, I don't have to obey it, or if it doesn't hurt anyone, it's okay to break the law. And we had acculturation factors, all related to their immigration experience. And there we measured alienation, feelings of alienation, feelings of marginality, and general acculturation experience as they perceive it. The regression is all the independent variables are composite scales, and the regression is stepwise. Since I wanted to see first the effect of the family, and then if the effect of the family stays when I add the other variables. So you can see here that monitoring. Okay, sorry. I ran the regression twice, once for boys and once for girls. The reason for that is that we discovered, again, in previous analysis, that the causes or the risk factors for boys and girls are different for the immigrants, and I just wanted it to be more precise. So this is the boys' delinquent behavior regression, and then I will show you the girls' one. You can see here that family status change is significant has a main effect, is significant only in the first step, and then when I added the delinquent peers and the other variables, it lost his significance. But I had also, in order to examine the moderation effect of family status change and monitoring, I had an interaction in the regression, and the interaction is significant. So we can see that the lower the monitoring, the more probability. The lower the monitoring, the more probability of becoming delinquent. We can see that the more experiences of parent-child conflicts, the more delinquency we have. And I'll just refer to the interaction, and then I will come to it at the end. I found that being in a stable family is a risk factor more than being in an unstable family. And this was the surprise of the data, and I must admit that first I was sure that I did something wrong. And I went to the data to double check all. I even went to the questionnaires, even though it was 10 years ago, and I had to make sure that all the coding were right, because it was very significant. And then I said, okay, maybe not juvenile delinquency, let's go to only violent, only property, only drug. I tried it over and over, and it repeatedly came with the same results. And you will see it again for the girls. Children that comes from intact families are more, children that comes from stable family, where the family structure doesn't change, are more prone to delinquency than children that comes from families that experience crisis in the family structure. I will try to explain it in 2 minutes. I will just show you that delinquent peers is significantly affecting the delinquency. Attitudes against obeying the law, of course, predict the delinquency. And what is interesting also here is that for boys, the factors that related to immigration are not significant. So they act like normal teenagers. It's not the effect of acculturation, but it's probably the effect of their adolescent difficulties. This is the girls' regression, and here you can see that there is no main effect of family status change, and the significant effect is for the interaction, but it becomes significant only when I added all the other variables. So if I take only the family factors, family status change does not affect directly the level of delinquency. But here again, I see the same effect. I see that girls that comes from stable families are more prone to delinquency than girls that come from unstable families. Again, we see the delinquent peers effect and the attitudes of disobeying the law. Here we can see also that immigration factors are affecting them, and we see that the more communication difficulties they have, the more delinquent they are. And immigration experience is their perceived experience. They were asked, all in all, how positive do you see the process of your adapting to the new society? And we can see here that the lowest they feel that they adapted to the society, the more they become delinquent. We also can see that the R-squared, the explained variants of the model of the girls are lower than the boys. The model of the girls explaining 26% of the analysis, and the model of the boys explain 42%. Okay, so if to sum up, family status itself, the family status itself does not predict delinquent behavior. You didn't see it in the regression because I took it out. When it was there, it was not significant in all the steps for boys and for girls. It wasn't important if it was the family status at the first wave or the last wave. As a factor, it does not predict delinquency. And as I said at the beginning, that there are studies that shows that children that comes from broken homes are slightly more delinquent than children that are coming from intact families. I think that it's also can also help me explain my surprising finding, because immigrants are, especially during the first 6 years, are too busy with surviving that they don't have a lot of time to deal with the other things. So I will just talk about it in a minute. I see that there is a direct effect of changes in family structure only for males, only for the boys, not for the girls, and that the interaction effect between changes in family structure and monitoring affect boys as well as girls. We see that as I said, that girls that comes, not girls, that teenagers that comes from stable families, for them monitoring, less monitoring, more affecting their probability of being delinquent. And the surprising finding, which I will probably deal with during the next weeks, the main effect of changes in family structure shows that youth from stable families are at a greater risk for delinquency. Now, I can just try to explain it. I know that it's the analysis is reliable. So now I try to understand why are these findings, and if you look at this special group, the former Soviet Union immigrants who came to Israel, then you must know two things. First, it's a big group. 1 million immigrants from former Soviet Union came to Israel in a decade, and Israel is not like European or American society. It's a very small society. So the society in Israel was 7 million, and it increased to 8 million. So you can just imagine that when you cross the street, you are most probable to encounter Russian immigrants. And the community, the Russian community in Israel is very close and very protective. This is one thing. The other thing is that most of the immigrants who came to Israel from Russia came from big cities. It is considered to be a highly educated group of immigrants. compared to other immigrants who immigrate from Russia to Europe, and compared to the level of education in Israel this time. So it's a strong community. They have a lot of inner strength that helps them to handle a lot of the difficulties. We see them now, 10 years later, we see that they tend to socialize together. We see it also in the study, being a part of a group of immigrants serves as a protective factor. It helps them to feel at home. Yeah. And I'm guessing that a breakdown in the family experiences of divorce or changes in the family structure are monitored by the community more than by the parents, and this is why the results are as such, but surely I have to check it more closely. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, so hello everybody. My name is Limor Yehuda, and my colleague is Reuven Yaacov is sitting here. And I'm going to present you today with a study that we have been doing, which is based on a national survey, which is focusing in 6 cities in Israel. This whole survey is dealing with neglecting families, neglected kids neglecting families. And I'm going to talk today about a specific perspective of relationship in those families. And I'm actually, what we did here is examining the gap in perceptions between mothers and adolescents at the same households in those neglecting families in order to maybe understand, have a better understanding of this relationship and the way they influence delinquency. And again, I'm repeating, among neglecting families. So, I'm going to first talk about neglect. Now, neglect is defined in the literature as something that you do not do, your passive behavior. It's a consistent failure of giving your child or providing your child with his basic needs. And if you're not doing this, you're a neglecting parent. Neglect is considered to have outcomes, either immediate outcomes or future outcomes, but it has its outcomes. And most of the researchers are reporting about the connection, the relation between neglect and juvenile delinquency, involvement in violent delinquency, and so on. I just want to emphasize, I'm not including any abuse behavior within this neglect behavior. Now, in terms of types of neglect, we can see the physical neglect, which is widely briefed in the literature and was found connected to juvenile delinquency. When I'm relating to physical neglect, I'm relating to behaviors of not giving your child enough food or proper clothing or proper housing, destroyed houses and very chaotic and dirty houses are included in this physical neglect thing. And one of the explanations of how neglect is related to juvenile delinquency is when the kids are like growing up in those neglected homes, they cannot host maybe friends, so and they have difficulties in pro-social peer networks, which increase the risk of later delinquency, as mentioned here. Another type of neglect is parental supervision, when you are actually not aware of where your kid is what is he doing, who is he hanging out with, what is he doing in a certain time, certain places. So that deals actually with neglect supervision. Educational neglect, where I'm referring to all this knowledge of parents about what their kids are doing at school, helping homework, going to those meetings with the teachers, being actually involved in whatever happens with your kid in school. So if you do not do it, it's about, we're dealing with educational neglect, and of course emotional neglect that deals with emotions, with feelings, with being attached, bond, close to your kid, knowing in terms of emotional issues, knowing what is happening with your kid, being interested in your kid. Now, all those types of neglect, of course, were found in many research as predictors of delinquency, but I want to focus in this research of mine on relationship. And relationships are dealing with emotions, with whatever happens between us and our kids. With my kids, and the way it affects delinquency. So we're here in this special conference, and we're dealing with here his theory among all, and attachment is like the A in this theory, and it deals with the bonds between parents and the child, and the importance of those bonds and this attachment in terms of preventing delinquency. Of course, involvement and belief and commitment are all in the same theory, but I want to emphasize whatever I'm doing here in those relationships in terms of attachment and bonds. So, other researchers are pointed the fact that strong bonds of attachment or caring are associated with the lower odds of delinquency. Positive parent-child attachment is connected to this fewer delinquency due to the child fear jeopardizing the relationship with his parents. So it actually repeats himself. So we know that when we are attached to our kids, we're interested, we know what happens with them in terms of emotional issues. It has a good effect on a less involvement in delinquency. Now, when we examine relationship, of course, relationships are not only about attachment or support or caring. It has its moments, and one of the moments, or a group of moments, is a conflictual moment in which you fight with your kid. Your kid is fighting with you, is angry with you. They're all adolescents, and it's a part of their growing up and being adult and having this special identity or developing special identity within this adolescent phase. So the conflict between child and parent are well discussed in the literature, and we know that conflicts are very common in parent-adolescent relationship, particularly in early adolescence. And that high level of conflict or coercive parenting, or when your kid is angry or impulsive or respond to you in a very rude manner or using aversive verbal contact during conflict, they are all related to conduct disorder and to delinquency. I just want to note in this notion that my previous research was dealing with looking at relationship in both levels of understanding many of the research that I read, studies that I read, were dealing with relationship either in the term of attachment, supportive, closeness, or conflictual. But when in my previous study, when we mix it together and we saw the combination of relationship in terms of conflictual and supportive at the same time, of how those two ingredients are working together in combination, we found that when the relationships are characterized by high conflicts between the child and his parent, and at the same time with high support, high closeness, like after you fight with the kid, you actually go and you don't shut down. You go and you approach him and you support him and you talk to him. When those two ingredients are working in their higher rates, it actually predicts the lower delinquency, and vice versa. When those two ingredients are working in their lower rate, like when it's like a very quiet house. Nothing happens, no conflicts, no fights, no anger, but then again, no support, no closeness, no attach, no bonds. So those two, when they're in their lower rate, they actually predict a lower chance, lower odds of delinquency. And I compared a two-parent family and single-parent mothers, and we found it's very consistent with other researchers that in one-parent family, it's the worst case. When it happens, it's always the rates are higher in terms of delinquency. So, this data regarding relationship that usually we are reading about is dealing with relationship, and studies are reporting, asking either adults, or parents, or their kids about the relationship. Sometimes they ask the parents and the kids about relationship, about what they think about each other, about analyzing the relationship. But maybe I'm mistaken, I didn't read something about the gap, and I'm suggesting here a specific look about the gap in perception, understanding the way a parent perceives the relationship, and at the same time the way his child is perceiving the same relationship, and understanding the gap, the specific combination of perception and the way those specific combinations of perception are influencing delinquency. Now, we chose to focus on mothers and not on fathers, and naturally, motherhood and mother is something that is widely reported in literature. Mothers have more experience in interacting or taking care of their children. Interaction with mother characterized by more connection, understanding, closeness, and involvement. Those are repetitive findings in many researches. And about fathers, so fathers interaction is more focused on instrumental goals, sport activities, future plans, and that's why we chose mothers in this specific study. So the research goal is to test the effect of this gap that I'm talking about, the perception gap between mothers and adolescents. This gap of perception about relationship of parent-child and the way it affects juvenile delinquency among neglecting families. So, what we did is, in order to measure the gap, we measured the gap in two different factors. We did the factor analysis, and we actually divided all variables of relationship into two different groups. The first group is the negative relationship factors, and it actually deals with hectic houses, with a lot of conflicts, a lot of fights, anger, disrespectful attitude of the kid towards his parents, and like a kid is here reporting, or the parent is reporting about a kid that whenever he gets up in the morning and he's like in a bad mood, they're gonna have a bad day with him, and he keeps reporting about this factor, describing a very conflictual and with a lot of fights between the parents and the children. Now, the other factor is the positive relation factor, and that actually describes an atmosphere of warmth and closeness and sharing and support between a child and his parent. So that's the other factor, and the gap was calculated like this. We calculated the gap by taking the scores given by the mothers, and reducing from those scores the scores given by the child, by the teenager. We did this calculation separately for negative relation and separately for positive relation. Now, in terms of the method in participants, we had 86 cases. 86 cases meaning 86 pairs of adolescents and their mothers that were asked in this very, very long questionnaire about all different kinds of relationship and behaviors within the household. And they are, of course, the children and mothers are all defined as coming from neglected families. The child are defined as neglected by the social welfare, the welfare office. The ages of the adolescents are 11 to 17. And all participants are characterized by low SES and treated by the welfare office and living in difficult neighborhoods. So a little bit about the tools. The questionnaire contains delinquency questionnaires that relates to violent behavior, to arson, to attacks, to burglaries, theft, and not burglaries, but more like theft. And the parent-child relationship questionnaire contains items that concerning different aspects of parent-child relations. And as I said before, we divided it into two main factors: negative conflictual factor, and the positive, which deals with warmth and closeness and attachment. So. We regressed those factors. Direction of the gap between perception. I want to say just one word about direction of the gap. Direction of the gap can be either positive or negative, or no gap. But what we found is that there's always a gap. And when the gap is negative, it means that the kid is actually perceiving himself within this relationship as a kid with, he has no conflict, he's not angry, he has no fight. And it's all like okay in terms of negative relationship. And at the same time, in order to get this negative gap, the parent is reporting the opposite picture. He's actually saying, no, my kid is problematic, and everything is hectic, and we fight a lot, he's angry. And when he gets up in the morning and is upset, I'm going to have a bad day as a parent. So when they're both describing an opposite picture, in which the kid is like optimistic and the parent is like more maybe pessimistic, so we're getting a negative gap. And a positive gap would be just the opposite. When the kid is like very, very, he criticizes himself and said, I'm problematic, I fight a lot, I'm very angry. When I get up in the morning, my parent's gonna have a lousy day, and that's the atmosphere. But this kid actually, in this, I didn't say it before, but I want to mention it now, that the negative factor, the relationship, actually says that a boy can be, the kid can come home and express himself. He's pissed off of whatever happened outside at school with friends, and he allows himself to express himself within the house also, being angry, and knowing that you're going to be angry and you can be angry at home, that's the negative factor. So it's a negative factor, but then again, I'm thinking about this negative factor a lot. So the positive gap is when, as I said, it's when the kid is very criticizing about himself, but the parent is like, he said, no, he's not that negative, he's actually not that problematic, we're not fighting a lot, he's not that angry, so there's a gap, and the gap is positive because the rates of the kid is much higher than the rates of the parent is given, and hence positive gap. Supervision, and when it's here in it's written in parent or parent's perception or teenager, I meant that we took those variables out of the parent point of view or teenager parent point of view. So supervision, physical neglect, permissive parents, and permissive parents in the eyes of the parent or in the eyes of the adolescent are taking into consideration here. Addressing community for help is the way that a parent is actually addresses community for help if he has problem with the kid and he needs to cope with him. Sense of coping ability is when the parent is actually reporting himself as someone that is capable. He feels capable of addressing problems and taking care of his kid behaviors or emotion, whatever. And school, of course, the way they operate in school, function in school. So they're all regressed onto the involvement in juvenile delinquency variable, which is a dichotomic variable, and yield as significant predictors of delinquency. Now, I want to say this. The gap in positive relation, and I remind the positive relation was dealing with attachment and bond and warm family, was found insignificant, so I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to focus now on the negative relation, the hectic, conflictual relationship between a child and parent. So, these are the findings. So, apart from family status that deals with a single parent or two-parent family, which is not significant, but every time I try to take it out of the equation, it just ruined everything. And I know from previous research of mine and from many other researchers that it is significant. And a single parent is totally different from two-parent families in terms of odds of delinquency. So I left it here, but the others are significant, and I'm going to talk about them. So the gap between perception and direction, you can see the opposite influence. So what we understand from here is that when the gap is negative, meaning when the kid is actually perceiving himself in terms of negative relationship and as not that problematic, he reports himself as just everything is like okay, but the parent is saying no, everything is not okay. We fight a lot. He's angry, and I'm having bad periods of time when he's angry and when he's in bad moods. So, in this picture of this negative gap, it actually predicts higher rates of delinquency, while the opposite picture is when the kid is very criticizing himself and said the relationship between me and my mother are very hectic, conflictual, but the mother says on the other hand, no, it's not that problematic, it's not that angry. So this is the combination of perceptions. And in this, what we call positive gap, it actually predicts a lower rate of delinquency. Now, the supervision neglect is, I think, easy to explain. Physical neglect as well, as when you have it in its high rates, it predicts higher involvement in delinquency. But I want you to look at the permissive parent and the permissive parent by the eyes of the parent. So those are 2 points of views of the teenager and his mother. But you see that the numbers are opposite. The permissive parent in the eyes of the teenager, it goes with whatever we know from the literature. Permissiveness is a good predictor of involvement in the delinquency, so that's okay. But then when you go and you ask the parents about their perception of permissiveness, like how permissive are you, it actually works opposite. It says here that when described as permissive by the parent, the more permissive you are, the lower delinquent the kid is. So how come? And I think it has to do a lot with, again, asking two parties in the same relationship, the kid and the parent, about the way they perceive things. Like permissiveness is sometimes it's about letting your kid be who you are. So we can judge it, and that's what we usually do. We say permissiveness is not good because we know it works bad, but maybe I see it here, when you ask the parents and the mothers, and they're supposed to report about their permissiveness, you see that it's different. So I'm just explaining. Maybe I try to find an explanation to understand this. That maybe it's conceptualized differently in the minds of mothers and parents than in the minds of teenagers. And that's why when you define yourself as permissive, the permissive maybe doesn't get that high scores, and it works opposite. It's like it does not predict higher rates of delinquency. Now, help by community is the more you go to the community and you trust community services to help you, and you actually address friends and services, so the lower rates of delinquency are predicted here. And sense of coping ability of the parent, a parent who says, yes, I can cope with him, I know what to do, I know to go and address these professionals, psychologists, criminologists, social workers, and get help. So it actually predicts a lower rate of delinquency. And of course, involvement in school, they are very involved, less delinquency. We know it from other researchers. So to summarize what I've just presented, or my interesting finding, for me at least, is the fact that a kid which is maybe over-aware or maybe, I don't know if exaggeration is the word, but he's overweight, he's taking responsibility, he sees himself in a relationship and says, listen, I'm problematic, I have a lot of fighting, and maybe he's a little bit, he's a kid, and they're adolescents, and everything in the adolescence is like way high on rates, because that's how they feel. And then again, when the parent, at the same time, is saying, no, it's not that problematic, it actually predicts lower delinquency rates, and the opposite picture of this kid, when maybe it's more interesting, I don't know, when a kid is saying, no, everything is okay, I'm not conflictual, I'm not fighting with them, and the parents say, no, he is conflictual, we have conflictual relationship, and we fight, and he's angry, and then this kid that is maybe, I'm just asking, I don't know, maybe is less aware, taking less responsibility, is going and is doing the same behaviors of less responsibility and less awareness outside, and maybe this is why he's more involved in delinquency outside, and that's why the numbers are like this. So I hope it was interesting, and thank you very much for listening.
Now me? Yes. So I think we have some minutes for some questions. I have questions, if no one has. No one's want to ask you? Can I ask Nicole, if you, with your permission, can I ask, do you think that there is sailing effect on what is, when you plot the graph on what is, so that these female who have been abused and those who have not been abused, and PTS, or the post-traumatic stress disorder, and how this, the interaction effect, it seems that can be a sailing effect on those who have been abused, on those who have been female abused, that is so high the levels of delinquency that the post-traumatic stress disorder effect, you cannot see it. Do you think that can be an explanation?
Yeah, I do think that makes sense as an explanation for that. Going into the study, I had hypothesized that having childhood maltreatment and also PTSD would raise them even higher, and that's not what we saw. We did see what kind of looks like what you're calling the ceiling effect there, and it was for the control sample that PTSD played that larger role, leading them to get up to the same levels of those who had been maltreated in childhood. Which makes me wonder if maybe they had some kind of other traumatic event that made them more similar to the childhood maltreatment group in some way.
Could be interesting to see if in boys, that's or in males, it happens the same. Yeah, thank you. And I want to ask the last opponent if after I read, I don't know if you have read the past week, the book from Sue Klebold. She is the mother of Dylan Klebold, one of the perpetrators of Colombian's high school mass murders. And what is, or at least what she gives us in the book, what we perceived when we read the book, is that there is a gap. There is a really gap from what is perceived of a loving and caring mother, is how she perceives himself, and a boy, adolescent boy that is clear, desperately needing for help with suicidal thoughts, etc. So my question is that perhaps it's not only in neglected families that these gaps occur, but also in a middle class, at least American society, can occur.
Yes, of course, but I can only report.
Yeah.
I can only. We studied it only among neglecting families, and my intuition, of course, parenting is about everybody, and but I can report, or I can take those findings and talk about only neglecting families. If I'm gonna study it along general society and not neglecting families, it will be maybe the same. I don't know.
For the future.
Yeah, future research.
And for Hagit, I have to say that she gave me a good surprise from an immigrant single parent that comes from a not disruptive but perhaps broken family. So I know, and is playing violent video games. So, but it's good at least to know that. So my question to you is, perhaps these families, I'm thinking at these immigrant families that are coming from Russia in so perhaps difficult also conditions than when they arrive to Israel, that perhaps, because the construct that you say for disruptive family was the divorce, wasn't it? So perhaps those families who keep together are very conflicted families between father and mother, and that's what have a conflict between father and mother, and that perhaps what is making worse or increasing the rates of delinquency in the kid.
Well, what we heard a lot from the respondents and we know also in Israel that a lot of families, a lot of immigrant families broke up during the period of immigrating because of the issue of being Jewish. So in Israel we have the law of return, and only Jewish origin can come to Israel and become citizens, and it's very strict. So they lived in Russia. A lot of them said, in Russia we had to hide our religion. In Israel, no one is accepting it because we can't prove that. So we have a lot of families that during the first year in the country, the father or the mother went back to Russia or to other place, and this was the main cause of family breakdown. Again, they have other reasons and difficulties, but we know that this is the major reason. And we also, the percentage of single parents that came from Russia is very high compared to the population in Israel. One third of the respondents came to Israel with a single parent families, and then they have a lot of family support from the grandmother and other family members that take the place of the missing parent. And since the community is so close, it protects them.
So, thank you very much.